And now, a story from the Appleseed.
So my best friend in the whole wide world is a guy named Skeeter. And Skeeter had an uncle named Uncle Harsh. And Uncle Harsh was Skeeter's mom's brother. He'd never been married. He was a professor. And somewhere along the way in his academic studies, he learned, this is going to blow your minds, that you can teach people lessons through storytelling. So he thought to himself, I'm going to learn some stories, and I'm going to find some people to tell these stories to. Well, the people who he found were myself and Skeeter, who at this time, when this started, we were about 5 years old. But Uncle Harsh, he would tell us the story, but he would never tell us the moral of the story. He would just finish the story, and then he would say, now dwell on that, and maybe you'll learn something. Well, he was either a bad storyteller or we were bad dwellers. Because anything we ever learned, I believe, was the wrong lesson. For example, the first time I remember Uncle Harsh telling us a story, he told us the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Now, I'm not going to tell you that because I think you probably already know it. But the reason Uncle Harsh told us that story is because for the first time in our lives, Skeeter and I were going to get to walk from his parents' house to his grandmother's house, all by ourselves, no adults there. Now, you have to understand, we lived in a little tiny town called Half Dollar, West Virginia. We had 2 streets in Half Dollar. One was called Main Street. The other one was called, nah, that ain't Main Street. So nowhere in that entire distance from Skeeter's house to his grandmother's house were we ever going to be unobserved by someone who knew us. But we didn't realize that. We just knew that for the first third of that distance, Skeeter's parents could see us. And for the last third of that distance, Skeeter's grandmother could see us. But in that middle third, no one could see us. It was the first time we were ever going to be free of adult supervision. And so Uncle Harsh sent us off. And as soon as we got into that middle third where no one that we knew thought we knew could see us, Skeeter turned left, away from his grandmother's house. And I said, where are you going? And he said, well, I dwelt on it. And we sure ain't going to my grandmother's house. And I said, why not? And he said, because if we go to her house, she's going to get eaten by a wolf. And I thought, yeah, that's true. So instead, we went to Schaefer's and we bought some candy. And then we went down to Skeeter Creek and we caught crawdads and salamanders. And then we went and watched the volunteer fire department wash the fire truck. And then we went to our buddy Wally's house and we watched TV until it was supper time. And we went back to Skeeter's house. At which point, we found out that we had been lost all day. All of Skeeter's family was at his house. His grandmother was there. Uncle Harsh was there. My entire family was there. The sheriff was there. And half the fire department was there. And when they asked us, why didn't you go to your grandma's house? Skeeter said, because Uncle Harsh told us that story, and I thought that if we went to grandma's, grandma was going to get eaten by a wolf. And Skeeter's grandmother thought that that was so funny and so hilarious that we didn't get in any trouble at all. So we learned a whole new lesson. And then Uncle Harsh told us, he would tell us ones that, well, let me just lay it down for you. This is a Jack story. Now, at this time, you've heard of Jack. Jack has been Jack and the Beanstalk, Lazy Jack. If you've been around any storytelling, you've heard of Jack. In this particular story, Jack isn't quite as nice as he normally is. In fact, Jack is kind of he spends a lot of time in bars doing things he shouldn't be doing. And in this particular story, he's in this bar, and the devil shows up. And the devil says, Jack, I'm taking you with me. It's time for you to go. I'm taking your soul down with me. And Jack says, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, I understand. I haven't been the greatest guy in the world, but let me get one more drink. And so the devil says, okay. They get one more drink. Comes time to pay. Jack doesn't have any money. So he says to the devil, you're magic, right? The devil says, yeah. Jack says, you can do anything you want to do, right? Devil says, yeah. Jack says, well, turn yourself into a gold coin, and then I will give you to the bartender to pay for this drink, and once the bartender puts you in the cash register, I'll leave, you can turn back into the devil. Devil says that's a great idea, because apparently the devil hasn't been paying attention for most of eternity. Turns himself into a coin. Jack takes the coin, puts it in his pocket, and leaves the bar. And the devil can't get out because Jack has a silver cross in his pocket, and the coin is against the cross. Devil is helpless. Yeah. So finally, the devil gets tired of being in Jack's pocket, and he says, Jack, let me out of here. And Jack says, all right, I'll let you out, but you got to promise you're not coming back for my soul for 10 years. Devil says, it's a deal. And so Jack lets him out. 10 years later, to the minute, the devil is back. He says, Jack, it's time to come with me. And Jack says, all right, that's fine. That's fine. I haven't lived the best life. I understand. I haven't done anything in the past 10 years to correct it, apparently, either. He said, but I'm a little bit hungry, and there's an apple at the top of this apple tree. If you, sir, please the devil, will climb that apple tree and get me that apple, I'll be ready to go. And the devil, who apparently also has learned nothing in the last 10 years, climbs the tree, and while he's in the tree, Jack cuts a cross in the trunk of the tree, and the devil can't get down past the cross. Jack leaves him up there. A couple of days, finally the devil's like, come on, Jack, I got stuff to do. You got to let me down. Jack says, fine, I'll let you down, but you have to promise that you'll just never, ever come for my soul again. Devil says, whatever, I don't even want your soul anymore. So the devil goes, but eventually Jack does die. And when he dies, his soul goes to heaven. And St. Peter's like, no, just get. So Jack's like, all right. So he goes down to where the devil spends most of his time. And the devil's like, no, I told you, I don't want you. You're just going to have to go back and roam the earth forever. So Jack says, all right, I'll go back, but it's a long, dark trip. Can I have a light? And so the devil gives Jack a piece of burning coal from the fires. And Jack, it's hot. So Jack's like, wow, that's hot. And so he reaches in his pocket where not only does he keep a silver cross at all times, but he also has a turnip. I don't know. This is folklore. People write these things. Maybe it meant something back then. People carried turnips in their pockets. So Jack hollows out the turnip, puts the burning coal in it, goes back up to the earthly realm, and he's been wandering the earthly realm ever since. And Uncle Harsh told us he only shows himself on Hallows Eve with the turnip, with the glowing coal in it, which is where we get the jack-o'-lantern, right. And then Uncle Harsh told us to dwell on that. Well, we dwelled on it. And for about 2 weeks, we carried silver crosses and turnips in our pockets, but nothing ever came from it. And then finally, Uncle Harsh told us the story where usually Jack and his mama, they're hungry. They're always hungry. And then the story starts out, they're hungry, and sometimes there's Will and Tom, and so mama will send out Will, try and do something, and he'll fail, and then she sends out Tom, and he fails, and then she sends out Jack, and Jack, usually mostly just by being stubborn, and by listening to the little gray person beside the street with whom Jack shares half of his food. Always remember that. Share half your food with the little gray person by the side of the street. Things will work out for you. But Jack does that. Usually then he meets the princess or the sheriff's daughter, gets the fortune, and gets married. And then, by the beginning of the next story, Jack and his mama are poor, and he's single again. So some people think that Jack stories are interesting, but I want to know what happens in between every Jack story. So in this particular story, he and his mama are poor, and it's Christmas, and Jack gets a shotgun for Christmas. But they're so poor, he only gets one shell. And so his mama says, go get us something to eat. And he goes out in the woods, and sure enough, he sees a rabbit standing right beside a boulder. And so Jack takes aim on that rabbit, and he's just about to pull the trigger when he sees another rabbit on the other side of the boulder. And Jack can't figure out which one of those rabbits he's going to shoot. And then he sees a squirrel on top of the boulder. So now he's like, which one do I? And then he gets a good idea. And he just shoots the boulder right in the middle. And the boulder cracks in half. This half kills this rabbit. This half kills this rabbit. And then the squirrel falls to its death. Because you see that happen all the time, don't you? A squirrel falls like 10 feet and is just dead. But more than that, the blast of the shotgun knocked Jack into the creek, and it took him half an hour to get out because his overalls filled up with so many fish that when he got out of the water and the pressure changed, the button in the middle of his overall shot off and killed a 12-point buck. Had been scared by all this ruckus. The buck was running through the woods. The The button hit the buck, killed it dead. The buck crashed into the ground. One of his antlers broke, and a piece of the antler flew off and hit a 1,200-pound wild boar. And Uncle Hart said, now dwell on that. And we dwelled on it, and no matter how hard we tried, we just couldn't stuff enough fish into Skeeter's overalls to get a button to pop off. So finally, what we did was we went into his garage. Now, Skeeter's mom was an avid garage sailor. Now, this is something that makes more sense if you're reading it, because I don't mean she sailed around in people's garages. I meant she would get up on Saturday morning and go to every single garage sale in the neighborhood or in the county. And if you've ever had an avid garage sailor in your family, you know. In our family, you probably know this saying that if there were an infinite number of monkeys with an infinite number of typewriters and an infinite amount of paper, eventually one of them would type the entire works of Shakespeare. In our family, we believe a lot, but we don't believe that. What we do believe is that if you had an infinite number of monkeys with an infinite number of cameras, that eventually one of them would take a picture of the Mona Lisa. So anyway, if you have that is a belief in our family. If you have an avid garage sailor in your family, you know that eventually you will own one of everything. Which is why in Dry County, West Virginia, where we lived, Skeeter had a wetsuit in his garage. So we went in the garage, he put on the wetsuit, I took duct tape and I wrapped it around his wrists and his ankles. We sewed a button right here. And then his dad was a volunteer fireman, so he had a length of fire hose in the back of his truck and a fire hydrant wrench. And we went down the street about 100 yards to the fire hydrant, and Skeeter was standing there, and I took the fire hose, I connected it to the hydrant, didn't turn it on yet, and then I took the end of the fire hose, the business end as they say, and I just stuck the nozzle down the wetsuit, and then I turned the fire hydrant on. Now, there are some adults in this room, and some of you probably consider yourself competent, or at least conscientious. And if you were driving down the road and you saw two kids standing by a fire hydrant, and one had on a wetsuit with a fire hose stuck down the back, and the other was messing with it, you might be compelled to say to yourself, I should stop and intervene in this situation. But I'm telling you, don't. Do not. I know from experience that those kind of kids only learn through experience. Just let them do it or they're not going to know. So I turned the fire hydrant on all the way, and the wetsuit just went whoosh, like that, and it exploded. And then Skeeter was standing there in nothing but duct tape and the wrists and the ankles of the wetsuit, but the button shot off, and it didn't kill a buck, but it did hit a Buick, which is only one letter different. And we went home, and Uncle Harsh told us the story of the Emperor's new clothes, and he didn't even have to tell us to dwell on it.
Thanks for joining us for a story from the Appleseed.